There is a peculiar sort of man who can scratch his nose perfectly well when it itches, but gets into philosophical trouble when a German doctor asks him to point at it. This was Schneider. Merleau-Ponty had a great deal to say about Schneider, and most of it becomes unsettling once you realize he wasn't merely talking about a damaged brain. He was using the poor fellow to pry open the floorboards beneath the rest of us. Schneider had been wounded in the head during the First World War. Afterwards, certain things became difficult for him. If a mosquito landed on his nose, he could swat it. If his nose itched, he could scratch it, put him in an actual situation, and his body generally knew its business. But ask him, for no particular reason, to point to his nose, and suddenly civilization had asked too much. This sounds ridiculous until you notice what the request requires. There is no mosquito. There is no itch. There is no practical reason to touch the nose. Schneider has to manufacture a little imaginary world in which touching his nose makes sense. He has to detach himself from what is actually happening and enter what could happen. Most of us perform this trick all day long and congratulate ourselves by calling it thinking. We sit in August and think about December. We stand in Montauk and imagine Paris. We hear 4 notes and anticipate the 5th. Somebody says, "Next year," and an invisible landscape immediately appears before us. Schneider's landscape had gone dim. Merleau-Ponty called part of the machinery behind this the intentional arc. It throws around us our past, our future, our physical surroundings, our social world, our possibilities. The important point is that we generally don't do this consciously. You don't wake up every morning and recite your autobiography before figuring out how to use a coffee cup. The cup is already meaningful. The room is already your room. Your hand already knows what hands do. The world arrives pre-interpreted, which means memory is much stranger than the little filing cabinet we usually imagine. We tend to think memory means remembering. I was 12. My father said this. I lived there. That happened Tuesday. But an enormous amount of the past survives without appearing as a recollection at all. It has become posture, expectation, taste, fear, timing. A way of reaching for a door handle. A way of recognizing someone's footsteps before you've consciously identified who is coming. A musician doesn't necessarily remember every hour he spent practicing a scale. The hours have vanished. Yet put the instrument in his hands and the dead hours start moving his fingers. The past has disappeared as an event and survived as an ability, that is passive memory. Or perhaps we should say the past has learned how to impersonate the present. And here Schneider becomes much more interesting, because Schneider did not entirely lose this kind of memory, quite the opposite. His habitual body still worked. He retained an enormous amount of embodied knowledge. What had become damaged was his ability to take what his body already knew and freely project it into an imaginary possibility. His past could still operate. It just had trouble dreaming. This is why saying Schneider simply lost passive memory doesn't quite work. His condition is more disturbing than that. The sediment remained. The horizon shrank. His body could say, "I can," but it had difficulty adding, "even though I'm not doing it right now." And then, several decades earlier, there was Friedrich Hölderlin sitting in a tower. This is where Agamben enters the story. Hölderlin had once been a poet moving through history with all the usual equipment, ambitions, friendships, intellectual movements, political hopes, loves, disappointments, destinations. Then something happened, or perhaps according to Agamben, we should be more careful with the word happened. Hölderlin withdrew. He spent roughly the final 36 years of his life living in a tower in Tübingen under the care of the Zimmer family. Visitors came. He walked. He played music. He wrote strange little poems. He adopted elaborate forms of politeness. He sometimes signed poems with invented names. The great machinery of biography seemed to have stopped turning. And Hölderlin reportedly said something magnificent. "Nothing happens to me." Now there is a sentence worth being suspicious of. Because obviously things happened. Morning happened, dinner happened, winter happened, visitors happened, poems happened, old age happened. The Neckar River continued doing whatever rivers do when philosophers are not watching them. So what could it mean to say nothing happens? Agamben's answer, or at least the possibility he wants us to consider, is that perhaps events continued while biography ceased. That distinction is enormous. Biography is not merely the passage of time. Biography is time organized around somebody. My childhood, my career, my catastrophe, my recovery, my plans, my future. Biography takes events and strings them onto an invisible wire called me. Agamben looks at Hölderlin's tower years and asks what remains when that wire loosens. His provocative answer is not necessarily nothing. Something remains. Habit remains. Dwelling remains. Language remains. Rhythm remains. A body continues occupying a world. And now Schneider and Hölderlin begin staring at one another across a century. They are not the same case. It would be a serious mistake to pretend they were. Schneider suffered a neurological injury. Merleau-Ponty analyzes genuine impairment. Agamben, by contrast, is deliberately resisting the temptation to reduce Holderlin's later existence to a psychiatric diagnosis. But put the two beside one another, and a strange philosophical experiment appears. Schneider shows us what happens when a person's ability to project himself into possibility becomes damaged, while much of habitual existence remains intact. Holderlin, at least in Agamben's telling, presents something almost inverse. What if a life ceased organizing itself primarily through projects, accomplishments and biography, yet continued to exist through habit and dwelling? Schneider says, the actual world remains, but possibility has become difficult. Holderlin seems to ask, why are you so certain possibility must look like a biography? And now we are in dangerous territory. Because once you start thinking this way, the ordinary self begins looking suspiciously like a trick of temporal bookkeeping. Consider what you call yourself. You possess memories. Certainly, but you are not remembering most of them now. They are absent. Your third birthday is presently nowhere to be found. Yesterday's breakfast has mostly joined the dead. Thousands of conversations have evaporated. Entire afternoons of your life have been erased so completely that, from the standpoint of consciousness, they might as well never have occurred. And nevertheless, you feel continuous. You say, I am the same person who was there. How do you know memory? But most of the memories aren't currently present. Maybe continuity doesn't depend primarily upon recollection. Maybe the past survives more quietly. The chair feels sittable. A certain chord wants another chord. A familiar voice carries 20 years inside a single syllable. You flinch before remembering why. You trust somebody before producing the evidence. You walk into your childhood home and your body recognizes dimensions your conscious mind had forgotten. Something remembers. But it isn't necessarily the little narrator inside your skull. Merleau-Ponty has a wonderful way of describing something close to this. There is another self that has already sided with the world. That line ought to bother us. Because which self is that? The one before thought. The one made out of habits. The one that reaches before I decide to reach. We generally imagine consciousness sitting at headquarters issuing orders. Left hand, pick up cup. Memory department, provide identity. Future planning, prepare Tuesday. But phenomenology suggests the organization may be backwards. The world is already underway before headquarters receives the report. Your body is already oriented. Your past is already operating. Possibility is already opening. Then consciousness arrives 5 minutes late, takes off its hat, and announces that it has been running the place. This is where the whole thing starts to sound like Philip K. Dick having coffee with Mark Twain after somebody has tampered with both men's memories. Suppose you woke tomorrow with exactly the memories you currently possess. Same childhood, same humiliation, same favorite songs, same people you love, same scar on your knee, and an entirely convincing story about how you got it. Would you know those memories had actually happened? You would know only that they were present. Memory contains almost no certificate of authenticity. A memory says this happened. But another mental event, a dream, can say precisely the same thing. While dreaming, we generally don't stamp each experience provisional reality, authentication pending. The dream simply arrives with a world attached, and sometimes with a past. You can dream that you have been married for 20 years to somebody who does not exist. Inside the dream, you don't have to dream all 20 years. You simply know them. The history comes bundled with the present, which raises an unpleasant little possibility. Maybe ordinary waking consciousness works similarly. Not necessarily because we are living in a simulation or because some cosmic electrician installed false memories Wednesday afternoon. Something stranger. Maybe the sense of having a past is itself something occurring now. The past may have happened. Presumably it did. But your experience of continuity with it exists only as a present phenomenon. The past is never here as past. It survives as traces. Memory, habit, expectation, scars, photographs, other people's testimony, architecture, muscle memory, a dent in the car. And from these traces the present constructs the extraordinary impression I've endured. Schneider exposes one piece of this machinery because something in his ability to project the world has broken. Holderlin exposes another because his life appears to have stopped obeying the usual biographical machinery altogether. And both cases lead toward an almost indecent question. How much of being a person requires having a story? Maybe less than we think. Imagine stripping things away: occupation, reputation, future plans. The story you tell about childhood, the explanation of why you are the way you are, your 5-year plan, your grudges, your heroic interpretation of your mistakes, the private documentary narrated continuously inside your skull. Suppose all that became quiet. Would anybody remain? Agamben's Holderlin suggests that this question cannot be answered as easily as psychiatry or biography would like. Perhaps somebody remains who walks, looks through a window, writes 4 lines, eats supper, greets a visitor ceremoniously, lives somewhere, repeats things, develops habits, dwells. A life without much story may still be a life. And perhaps this is what makes Holderlin's remark, "Nothing happens to me," so extraordinary. Maybe the emphasis belongs on me. Things happen, but perhaps they no longer coagulate into the usual owner. Rain falls. A visitor arrives. A poem gets written. Evening comes. But the great customs officer of consciousness no longer stamps every event. Mine. And now habit looks different too. We generally regard habit as the boring enemy of freedom. You do something automatically, therefore you weren't free. But both Merleau-Ponty and Agamben make that assumption difficult to maintain. Habit is what allows freedom in the first place. If you had to consciously reconstruct walking every morning, you would never get out of the bedroom. The freedom to improvise on an instrument depends upon thousands of movements becoming automatic. The freedom to speak depends upon not consciously selecting every grammatical rule. Freedom floats on an ocean of things we no longer have to decide. So perhaps habit isn't freedom's opposite. Perhaps habit is the anonymous intelligence supporting it. And Schneider shows us what happens when that anonymous intelligence remains, while one dimension of transcendence, the leap toward the merely possible, is injured. Whereas Holderlin makes us wonder whether a human being might cease making those leaps so aggressively and still possess a meaningful form of existence. Which brings us back to memory. Maybe memory's deepest function isn't telling us what happened. Maybe memory is what allows the world to arrive already meaningful. The past isn't merely behind you. It is hiding inside what seems obvious. You see a staircase and immediately perceive something climbable. You see a friend's face and don't have to reconstruct the friendship. You pick up a guitar and your hands inherit dead afternoons. The past does not knock. It has a key. And if that is true, then what we call a self may be far less like a permanent object traveling through time and far more like a style continually regenerated by the meeting of habit and world. A melody is a good analogy. You hear a note, then another. The first note is gone, literally gone, yet the second note sounds different because the first existed. By the fourth note, none of the previous notes remain as sounds. Nevertheless, there is a melody. Where is it? Not in any single note. Not in the past notes because they have vanished. Not entirely in the present note either. The melody exists as a relationship between what is no longer present and what is presently arriving. And perhaps we are like that. A person may be less like a thing, and more like a melody whose earlier notes have disappeared, but continue changing the meaning of the notes sounding now. Schneider's melody loses some of its ability to anticipate where it might go. Holderlin's melody stops trying so hard to become a symphony, and the rest of us keep hearing the tune and calling it me, which may be perfectly reasonable, or it may merely be the oldest habit we have.